Legend paints humanity as the undisputed gods of the galaxy, beings capable of crushing armadas with a mere glance and walking through plasma fire as if it were a light drizzle. Out in the blood-soaked mud of the outer rim, however, the alien grunts didn't buy a single word of those tales. Viewing us as nothing more than fragile sacks of water and bone, they openly laughed at our myths and mocked our history. That arrogance lasted exactly until their greatest war hero sat by the fire, looked his soldiers dead in the eye, and revealed the terrifying truth. The atmospheric recycler in Barracks 4 on Outpost Bradley had a busted bearing. It didn't hum, it ground. A rhythmic, metallic scrape that chewed into the base of Edmund's skull every 4 seconds. Scrape, hiss, scrape, hiss. Edmund sat in the corner booth of the mess hall, picking at a sliver of peeling gray paint on the table. His thumb traced the jagged edge of the fleck, feeling the abrasive rust underneath. He was nursing a mug of synthetic coffee that smelled like burnt electrical wire and tasted faintly of copper. The liquid was lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Outside, the monsoon season of this miserable rock was in full swing. The rain didn't fall. It assaulted the corrugated tin roof in a deafening, continuous roar. The outpost smelled of wet dirt, rotting ozone, and the sour, pervasive stench of unwashed bodies trapped in a confined space. Across the room, bathed in the flickering, harsh fluorescent light of a failing overhead bulb, sat Higgins and Davies. Their real names were a string of guttural clicks and deep chest rumbles that human vocal cords couldn't replicate. But Edmund's neural implant effortlessly scrubbed the audio, localizing them into flat, Western surnames. They were Graxians, tall, broad-shouldered bipeds with skin like cured leather and pale, sunken eyes. They were infantry, grunts, cannon fodder, just like Edmund used to be. Right now, they were laughing. It was a grating, coughing sound, like a dog choking on a bone. Higgins slapped his thick, 3-fingered hand against the metal table. The impact made their empty ration tins rattle. "I'm telling you, it's in their official databanks," Higgins wheezed, wiping a tear of milky fluid from his eye. He tapped the cracked screen of a stolen human data pad. They actually believe their ancestors used to hunt by just walking. Davies leaned in, his heavy jaw dropping. Walking. Yes, they call it persistence hunting, Higgins read, squinting at the glowing blue text. They claim early humans would pick a target, a beast twice their size, and just follow it, not sprint, not pounce, just walk after it until the animal collapsed from heat exhaustion. Davies let out a snort that blew a bubble of thick mucus from his nostril. He wiped it away with the back of a scaly hand. That is the stupidest piece of biological fiction I have ever heard. You cannot walk prey to death. The caloric expenditure alone would kill the predator first. You overheat, your muscles tear, your heart gives out. It's physics. Exactly, Higgins barked, leaning back and kicking his heavy boots onto the table. But look at this propaganda. They feed this to their recruits. We are the relentless shadow. We do not stop. It's pathetic. They're squishy. I bumped shoulders with a human contractor on the landing deck yesterday, and the guy bruised, actually turned purple. And they expect us to believe they used to march megafauna to death? Edmund kept his eyes on his mug. He didn't interject. He didn't feel the sudden, surging pride of humanity bubbling up in his chest. He just felt tired. His left knee ached, a deep, throbbing pressure where the cartilage had been replaced by cheap, military-grade synthetic mesh. He knew the truth about persistence hunting. He knew it wasn't some glorious, heroic endeavor. It was miserable. It was blisters popping inside boots, sweat stinging your eyes, the horrific gnawing cramps in your calves that made you want to just lie down and die in the dirt. Humans didn't keep walking because they were badass gods of war. They kept walking because they were terrified of starving. It was desperation, not dominance. Edmund took a sip of the bitter synth calf. It coated his tongue in a thin film of grease. Let them laugh, he thought. The Graxians were built for explosive power, fast ambushes, high impact. They didn't understand the slow, grinding misery of endurance. They didn't understand that humans were just too stubborn, or maybe too stupid, to know when to lie down. It gets better, Higgins chuckled, scrolling further down the datapad. Listen to this mythology. Vampires, undead humans that drink blood and can't be killed by conventional weapons. Zombies, dead flesh reanimating to bite the living. They are obsessed with the idea that they can just ignore death. It's a psychological defense mechanism, Davies said, adopting a mock scholarly tone. They know their bodies are fragile. A single kinetic round turns them to paste. So they invent stories where they transcend biology. It's sad, really. Edmund felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He reached up and rubbed the thick, puckered scar tissue on the side of his neck. Ignore death. If only it were that simple. The laughter across the mess hall shifted. Higgins tossed the datapad onto the table, the screen cracking a little more against a metal tray. The conversation turned away from ancient fairy tales and bled into the modern era. The war stories, the rumors that floated around the transit stations and medical wards. It's not just the old myths, though, Davies said, his voice dropping an octave, losing some of its drunken humor. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the sticky table. You hear the crap they spout about the siege of Fort Bradley? The human propaganda corps went into overdrive on that one. Edmund froze. The mug stopped halfway to his mouth. The air in the mess hall suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. The rhythmic scraping of the atmospheric recycler faded into the background, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. Fort Bradley. I heard the broadcasts, Higgins sneered, though the sound was a little hollower this time. They claim a human platoon held the trench line for 6 days after their atmospheric generators failed. 6 days breathing toxic sulfur. Impossible, Davies countered immediately, shaking his head. Sulfur inhalation melts the alveolar linings in the lungs within 4 hours. You drown in your own blood. I don't care what kind of scrubbers they had in their helmets. Once the seals broke, they were dead. And that's not even the worst of it, Higgins continued, dropping his voice lower. I had a cousin in the 4th Armored. He said the humans started taking combat stims. Claimed they saw humans taking plasma bolts to the chest, losing limbs, and still firing their weapons. Said a human with no legs dragged himself 20 meters to detonate a kinetic charge. Davies barked a laugh, but it was nervous, forced. Nervous system shock. If a plasma bolt hits you, the thermal expansion boils the water in your tissues. The pain receptors overload the brain, and you shut down. It is a biological absolute. A human dragging himself with no legs? It's ghost stories, Higgins. They want us to be afraid of them. Edmund stared into the black, oily surface of his coffee. He didn't see his reflection. He saw the trench. He smelled it too. A sudden phantom stench of cooking meat. burning plastic, and the sharp, coppery tang of vast quantities of blood. He felt the grit of the red dirt in his teeth. They were talking about Tommy. Edmund's hand began to tremble, just a slight high-frequency vibration in his fingers. He gripped the mug harder, trying to force the tremor out, but the ceramic felt slick with his sudden, cold sweat. It wasn't a heroic moment. Tommy hadn't yelled a battle cry. When the Graxian artillery shell shattered the trench wall, a chunk of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate had sheared through Tommy's waist. It hadn't been a clean cut. Tommy hadn't stoically dragged himself toward the enemy to save his squad. Tommy was a 19-year-old kid who liked bad jazz music and collected vintage bottle caps. When the lower half of his body was detached, his brain had simply shattered. Edmund remembered the sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a high, wet, bubbling shriek that tore Tommy's vocal cords. The combat stims, auto-injected by his suit to keep his heart beating, had turned him into a biological nightmare. His body refused to die. His hands, digging into the mud, pulling his torso forward, weren't moving with purpose. It was raw, electrical spasms. It was a dying animal thrashing in a trap. Tommy had dragged himself 20 meters because his brain was short-circuiting in absolute, unadulterated agony, desperately trying to crawl away from the pain. He detonated the kinetic charge by accident, his flailing hand smashing into the primer on his belt. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't propaganda. It was the ugliest, most horrific thing Edmund had ever seen. "They're weak," Davies concluded, slamming his fist on the table, snapping Edmund back to the present. The phantom smell of blood vanished, replaced by the damp mold of the barracks. "Strip away their orbital strikes and their fancy drones and put them in the mud. They break. They bleed. They die just like anything else." Edmund unclenched his jaw. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to walk over to their table, grab Davies by the collar of his uniform, and scream in his face. He wanted to make them understand that humans didn't fight because they were strong. They fought because they were absolutely pants-wettingly terrified, and fear made them dangerous. But he didn't move. He just took another sip of his cold coffee. What was the point? Let them believe the universe was clean and logical. Let them believe biology was a strict set of rules. The heavy blast doors of the mess hall hissed open. The sound of the rain instantly grew louder, accompanied by a gust of cold, wet wind that swept through the room, rattling the empty ration tins. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed on the metal grating. Clang, whir, clang, whir. Every Graxian in the mess hall went rigid. Higgins and Davies snapped their mouths shut, pushing their chairs back and scrambling to stand at attention. General Sullivan walked in. Like the others, his name was a translation, an auditory illusion provided by Edmund's implant. But there was nothing illusory about the physical space the alien occupied. Sullivan was a veteran of the long wars, a creature built for violence who had survived enough of it to be broken down and put back together. He was missing his left arm. In its place was a heavy, utilitarian prosthetic made of raw, unpainted tungsten. The servos whined with a high-pitched mechanical strain every time he moved it. The right side of his face was a tapestry of burn scars. The leathery skin melted and fused over a cybernetic optical sensor that glowed a dull, angry red. He smelled of sterile medical iodine and the sharp ozone tang of freshly discharged energy cells. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a monument to suffering. Sullivan paused just inside the door. Water dripped from his heavy tactical cloak, pooling on the floor. His lone organic eye scanned the room, settling briefly on Edmund in the corner, before moving to Higgins and Davies, standing rigidly by their table. "At ease," Sullivan rumbled. His voice was deep, gravelly, sounding like heavy stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. Higgins and Davies relaxed slightly, though their shoulders remained tight. Sullivan walked over to the dispensing machine. He punched the heavy metal buttons with his prosthetic hand. The machine groaned and spat out a mug of boiling, black liquid. He didn't drink it immediately. He turned, leaning his massive weight against the machine, and looked at the two privates. "You were laughing," Sullivan said. It wasn't a question. Higgins swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing beneath his scaled throat. "Sir, yes, sir, we were just discussing." "Discussing," Sullivan repeated flatly. "Human myths, sir," Davies chimed in, eager to appease the general. He pointed at the cracked datapad on the table. "Propaganda. We were reading about their persistence hunting and the ghost stories from Fort Bradley. Nonsense about them fighting with severed limbs. We were just remarking on the absurdity of it, the biological impossibility." Sullivan's red optical sensor whirred, zooming in on the datapad, then panning slowly to Davies's face. The silence in the room stretched. The scraping of the broken atmospheric recycler seemed to echo louder. Edmund held his breath. He watched Sullivan's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. It wasn't anger that washed over the general's scarred face. It was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Biological impossibility," Sullivan echoed softly. He walked slowly toward their table. The heavy clang whir of his gait felt like a countdown. He pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, the metal frame groaning under his weight. He set his steaming mug on the table. "Sit," Sullivan commanded. Higgins and Davies scrambled to sit back down, their eyes wide, darting between the general and each other. Sullivan reached out with his organic hand and picked up the cracked datapad. He stared at the glowing blue text for a long time. Then he looked up, past the privates, and locked eyes with Edmund across the room. Edmund didn't look away. He saw the recognition in the general's eyes. It was the shared, ugly kinship of two men who had seen the bottom of the abyss. Sullivan gave Edmund a barely perceptible nod. "You read the manuals, privates," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding murmur that forced Higgins and Davies to lean in. "You study the anatomical charts. You learn that a human is 70% water, that their skeletal structure is calcium, that their skin tears with less than 40 pounds of pressure." "Yes, sir," Higgins whispered. "You apply logic," Sullivan continued, tapping a heavy claw against his mug. "You think of war as an equation. A kinetic round strikes a vital organ, blood pressure drops, the brain is deprived of oxygen, the enemy dies. It is clean. It is math." Sullivan took a slow breath. The servos in his prosthetic arm clicked as he clenched his metal fist. "I was at Fort Bradley," Sullivan said softly. The air left Higgins's lungs in a soft hiss. Davies went completely still. "I was a captain," Sullivan went on, his red eye dimming slightly as he looked inward into the past. "We breached their defensive perimeter on the 4th day. We shattered their atmospheric generators. By all our calculations, the sector should have been dead within hours. We marched in to clean up the corpses." He leaned closer to the two young soldiers. The smell of iodine and ozone radiating from him was overpowering. "You think they are weak because they are soft," Sullivan said, his voice trembling with a sudden, quiet intensity. "You think their fragility makes them pathetic. You are fools. Their fragility is exactly what makes them the most terrifying creatures in the galaxy." Sullivan raised his prosthetic arm, slamming it down onto the table. The metal buckled under the force. Higgins jumped. "Logic dictates a broken machine stops," Sullivan growled. "If you shear the leg off a Graxian heavy walker, it falls over. It powers down. But humans—" Sullivan swallowed, looking back at Edmund. "Humans are not machines. They are a localized defiance of physics. They are a glitch in the universe. When their bodies break, when their blood boils, when logic and biology scream at them to die, they get angry." Sullivan traced the massive burn scar on the side of his face. "I watched a human," Sullivan whispered, the sound barely audible over the rain. "A small one, half my size. He had taken a plasma burst to the chest. His armor was melted into his ribs. His lungs were burning in the toxic air. He should have been dead. The math said he was dead." Edmund closed his eyes. The tremor in his hand returned. Tommy, or someone just like him. "He didn't die," Sullivan said, his voice hollow. He looked at me. His eyes were entirely red, hemorrhaged, and he smiled. He pulled the pin on a thermal detonator and he ran at me. He wasn't running with his muscles. His muscles were gone. He was running on pure, weaponized spite. Sullivan leaned back, the metal chair creaking. He looked at the two terrified grunts. "They don't fight to win, privates," Sullivan said, his tone dead and flat. "When they are cornered, when they are broken, they fight to ensure you lose. They will drag themselves through the mud with their teeth just to spit blood in your eye before they expire." The general picked up the data pad and crushed it in his tungsten grip. The glass shattered, the screen flashing white before going permanently dark. He let the pieces fall onto the table. "Keep laughing at their myths," Sullivan said, standing up, his heavy footsteps retreating toward the door. "But pray you never have to see the truth." The heavy blast doors hissed shut behind General Sullivan, cutting off the howl of the monsoon for a fraction of a second before the metallic scrape of the broken atmospheric recycler filled the void again. Scrape, hiss, scrape, hiss. Nobody spoke. Higgins and Davies remained frozen in their metal chairs, staring at the shattered remains of the data pad on the table. The white-blue light from the cracked screen sputtered, flickered twice, and died completely, leaving a small pile of jagged glass and twisted polymer in the dim fluorescent lighting. Edmund didn't wait for them to recover. He placed his hands flat on the sticky surface of his table and pushed himself up. His left knee screamed. The synthetic mesh ground against his femur, sending a sharp, electrical spike of pain up his thigh and into his lower back. He didn't wince. He was used to the pain. It was the only thing that felt completely real some days. He limped toward the exit, his boots sticking slightly to the grimy floor. He didn't look at the two Graxian privates as he passed their table. He could smell their sweat, a pungent, ammonia-laced odor that spiked when their species experienced acute stress. Sullivan had terrified them. He had taken their clean mathematical universe and introduced it to the messy, illogical horror of human survival. Edmund hit the release pad for the blast doors. They ground open, and the noise of the rain hit him like a physical blow. He stepped out into the dark. Outpost Bradley wasn't a fortress. It was a scar on the landscape. It was a sprawling network of prefabricated metal bunkers, trench lines, and landing pads hastily dropped onto a mud ball of a planet that rotated too close to a red dwarf star. It was perpetually twilight, perpetually raining, and perpetually sinking into the muck. The rain here was thick. It felt heavy, laden with particulate matter from the orbital mining platforms that operated in the upper atmosphere. It coated Edmund's synthetic jacket in a greasy gray film within seconds. The cold soaked through the seams, settling into the marrow of his bones. He pulled up the collar of his jacket and began the slow, agonizing walk toward the perimeter barracks. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to pull them off with every step. Pure, weaponized spite. Sullivan's words rattled around inside Edmund's skull, competing with the deafening roar of the rain on the metal roofs. Spite. That was the alien interpretation. They saw a human missing half his body, dragging himself through the mud with a live grenade, and they assumed it was a calculated act of vengeance. They assumed it was a conscious decision to inflict maximum casualties. Edmund stopped under the yellow halo of a sodium floodlight. He leaned heavily against the corrugated steel wall of a storage container, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The tremor in his hand had spread to his arm. He pressed his forearm against the cold, wet metal of the wall, trying to steady it. It wasn't spite. Edmund had been there at Fort Bradley. He had been in the mud. He knew what happened when the plasma hit, when the oxygen scrubbers failed, when the sulfur began to melt the soft tissue in your throat. Your brain didn't form complex thoughts about vengeance. It didn't calculate the tactical advantage of a suicide run. It just panicked. It was a lizard brain override. The human nervous system was a flawed, over-engineered nightmare. When exposed to catastrophic trauma, instead of shutting down peacefully like a Graxian, a human body dumped every single drop of adrenaline, cortisol, and endorphin it had into the bloodstream. It was a chemical firestorm. You didn't feel brave. You felt a terrifying, blinding terror. You felt an absolute, desperate need to get away, to strike out, to survive for just one more second, even if that meant crawling over your own severed limbs to do it. Tommy hadn't wanted to kill Graxians. Tommy had just wanted his mom. He had wanted the pain to stop. His dying brain had just fired random violent signals into his remaining muscles until his heart finally gave out. Edmund slid his back down the cold steel wall until he hit the mud. He sat there in the rain, the greasy water running down his face, pooling in the collar of his jacket. He pulled his knees to his chest and rested his forehead on his arms. The galaxy thought humans were demons. They thought humanity possessed a dark, indomitable spirit that defied the laws of biology. They didn't realize humans were just meat that was too terrified to die gracefully. The medical bay was located in Sublevel 2, dug deep into the bedrock to protect it from orbital bombardment. It was the only place on Outpost Bradley that didn't smell like wet dirt and ammonia. Instead, it smelled sharply of industrial bleach, synthesized blood plasma, and the distinct acrid odor of laser-cauterized flesh. Edmund sat on a cold steel examination table, a thin paper sheet crinkling loudly under him every time he shifted his weight. The harsh, surgical lighting made his pale skin look translucent, highlighting the jagged purple web of scar tissue that crawled up his neck and disappeared into his hairline. Dr. Hayes stood across the room, his back turned, rummaging through a supply cabinet. Hayes was human, one of the few left on the outpost. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full 8 hours in a decade. His medical coat was stained with brown, faded spots that Edmund knew better than to ask about. His hair was thinning, and his shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. "I need stabilizers, Doc," Edmund said, his voice flat. He kept his eyes fixed on a rust stain on the floor tiles. Hayes didn't turn around. He just sighed, a long, ragged exhalation that ended in a wet cough. "You're maxed out on your dosage, Edmund. The synaptic suppressants are already chewing holes in your liver lining. If I up the milligram count, you'll start pissing blood by Tuesday." "I don't care," Edmund said. He held up his left hand. The tremor was violent now. His fingers vibrated so fast they were a blur. It wasn't cold. It wasn't fear. It was the synthetic nerve splices in his spine misfiring, translating old psychological trauma into continuous physical spasms. Hayes finally turned, holding a small metal auto-injector. He walked over to the table, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He looked at Edmund's shaking hand, then up to his sunken, exhausted eyes. "You've been listening to the grunts again," Hayes murmured. He didn't ask. He knew. "General Sullivan was in the mess hall," Edmund replied, his jaw tight. "He gave a speech, told the kids about Fort Bradley." Hayes paused, the auto-injector hovering an inch from Edmund's shoulder. The doctor's face hardened, the cynical, exhausted mask slipping for a brief second to reveal a flash of raw, unfiltered grief. Hayes had been a field surgeon at Bradley. He had amputated more limbs in those 6 days than most doctors saw in a lifetime. "Sullivan," Hayes muttered bitterly. "The walking tank. What did he say?" "He told them we were a glitch," Edmund said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Told them we fight on spite, that we run on severed legs just to spit in their eyes." Hayes let out a dark, hollow chuckle. He pressed the auto-injector against Edmund's shoulder and pulled the trigger. There was a sharp hiss, and a line of icy cold fire shot down Edmund's bicep. "Spite," Hayes repeated, tossing the empty injector into a biohazard bin. "God, they really don't get it, do they?" "No," Edmund said softly. He watched his left hand. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent tremor began to subside, settling into a dull, manageable twitch. The chemical ice spread through his veins, numbing his chest, slowing his racing heart. "They have redundant organs," Hayes said, leaning against the examination table, crossing his arms over his stained coat. "Agraxian takes a round to the primary lung. Their secondary sphincter seals it off. Their blood pressure drops. They enter a localized coma to prevent further blood loss. Their biology is designed to preserve the machine, to shut down and wait for repair." Hayes reached up and rubbed his eyes. They were bloodshot and deeply ringed with purple shadows. "But us," Hayes gestured vaguely at Edmund's scarred chest. "We don't have redundancies. We just have a central nervous system that refuses to accept the math. I had a kid on my table at Bradley, 19 years old. Half his face was gone. Plasma burn. His brain was exposed. He should have been dead before he hit the mud." Edmund squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to be back there. "He grabbed my wrist," Hayes whispered, the clinical detachment entirely gone from his voice. "He grabbed my wrist so hard he bruised the bone. He couldn't speak. He couldn't see. But he was fighting me. He thought I was the enemy. His body was literally falling apart. His organs were shutting down, and his brain was pumping him full of so much adrenaline he was trying to choke his own medic to death. Hayes looked at Edmund, his eyes wet but perfectly steady. That's not spite, Edmund. That's not bravery. That's a biological nightmare. We are trapped in meat suits that would rather tear themselves to pieces than let go. The Graxians think we're heroes because we don't stop. They don't realize we don't stop because we can't. Our bodies won't let us. Edmund hopped off the examination table. His knee ground, but the pain was muffled now, hidden behind a thick chemical fog of synaptic stabilizers. "Thanks for the fix, Doc," Edmund muttered, pulling his damp jacket tighter around his shoulders. "It's temporary," Hayes warned, turning back to his supply cabinet. "The trauma is in the wetware, Edmund. You can't drug away a ghost." Edmund walked out of the med bay without another word. The heavy blast doors sealed shut behind him, cutting off the smell of bleach and leaving him in the cold, damp corridor. He touched the scar on his neck. The skin felt numb. He preferred the pain. Third watch, 0200 hours, Sector 4, perimeter. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a dense, clinging fog that rolled off the nearby swamps and swallowed the outpost whole. The sodium floodlights mounted on the concrete walls cut thick, yellow cones through the mist, illuminating nothing but swirling gray vapor and the rusted razor wire barricades 50 meters out. The silence was worse than the rain. Without the constant drumming on the metal roofs, the swamp came alive. It was a subtle, insidious symphony, the wet slop of mud shifting, the distant, throaty croak of an amphibious scavenger, the hum of the high-voltage perimeter fence. Edmund stood in a reinforced guard tower, his synthetic knee locked into a brace to keep him upright. He held a standard-issue kinetic pulse rifle across his chest. The metal of the gun was freezing, leaching the heat from his tactical gloves. He hated the night watch. The darkness stripped away the distractions. It left him alone with the ghosts. Sharing the tower with him was a Graxian corporal named Miller. Miller was young, barely out of his molting phase, his scales still retaining a bright, greenish hue that hadn't yet been dulled by years of dirt and radiation. Miller stood rigidly at attention, his optical sensors panning methodically left to right, scanning the fog with machine-like precision. Miller hadn't spoken a word to Edmund for 3 hours. The Graxians generally avoided the humans on outpost duty. Ever since Sullivan's speech in the mess hall earlier that day, the avoidance had turned into a quiet, reverent fear. Edmund could feel Miller glancing at him out of the corner of his eye, studying him like he was an unexploded bomb. "He thinks I'm a monster," Edmund thought, his grip tightening on his rifle. "He thinks if the wire gets breached, I'm going to rip my own arm off and beat the enemy to death with it." Suddenly, the proximity alarms on the tower console chimed. A soft, rhythmic ping. Miller snapped to attention, his heavy pulse cannon coming up in a fluid, practiced motion. "Movement, grid 7, 55 meters, just outside the wire." Edmund's heart slammed against his ribs. The chemical fog of the stabilizer shattered instantly, burned away by a sudden, massive spike of adrenaline. His breath hitched in his throat. His mouth went completely dry. He leaned over the concrete barrier, peering into the yellow fog. He couldn't see anything, just shadows moving within shadows. "Thermal signature is erratic," Miller reported, his voice calm, flat, completely devoid of panic. He was reading the data on his helmet display. Size is roughly equivalent to a Graxian hound, moving parallel to the fence line. Ping, ping, ping. The console alarm quickened. Edmund felt the sweat break out on his forehead. His hands started to shake. The rifle felt heavy, clumsy in his grip. His mind flashed back to the trenches, to the mud, to the Graxian sappers crawling through the fog, their mandibles clicking in the dark before the plasma charges detonated. "Breathe," Edmund told himself, squeezing his eyes shut for a microsecond. "It's just a swamp rat. It's just a local scavenger. Breathe." But his body wasn't listening. The lizard brain had taken over. His pupils dilated to let in more light. His blood pulled away from his extremities, pooling in his core, preparing his organs for catastrophic trauma. He was hyperventilating, short, sharp gasps of damp air that tasted like ozone and fear. "Target is approaching the wire," Miller stated calmly. "Distance 40 meters, 35. Edmund flipped the safety off his rifle. The metallic click sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent tower. Miller glanced at him, his reptilian eyes narrowing. He saw Edmund's shaking hands. He saw the sweat pouring down the human's pale face. He saw the sheer, unadulterated panic in Edmund's wide eyes. But Miller didn't see weakness. Because of Sullivan's myth, Miller saw exactly what he expected to see. He saw a predator preparing for maximum violence. He saw the legendary human bloodlust kicking in. He interpreted Edmund's paralyzing terror as coiled, explosive rage. "Hold fire, human Edmund," Miller whispered, his voice tinged with a sudden, deep respect. "Do not expend your energy. It is likely just local fauna. I have the firing solution locked." Edmund couldn't speak. His throat was entirely closed off. He just stared into the fog, his finger trembling violently against the trigger guard. He wanted to run. He wanted to drop the rifle, turn around, and sprint back to the med bay, back to the smells of bleach and safety. Crack. A blue bolt of superheated plasma erupted from Miller's cannon, tearing a hole through the fog. It struck something in the mud 50 meters away. There was a wet thud, a sharp, brief squeal that sounded like tearing metal, and then silence. The proximity alarm on the console went flat. "Target neutralized," Miller said, lowering his weapon. He turned to Edmund, his posture relaxing slightly. He gave Edmund a slow, deferential nod. "Your restraint is commendable. I know your instinct is to close the distance and engage in melee. But standard protocol dictates ranged suppression." Edmund stared at the young alien. He looked at Miller's calm, steady hands. He looked at the slow, even rise and fall of the Graxian's chest. Miller's biology hadn't betrayed him. He had identified a threat, neutralized it, and remained entirely in control. Edmund slowly engaged his safety. His legs felt like water. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Nausea churned in his gut, tasting like battery acid. He leaned heavily against the concrete wall, trying to hide the fact that he could barely stand. "Yeah," Edmund croaked, his voice cracking. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a trembling, gloved hand. "Restraint. Right." Miller turned back to the fog, standing tall, proud to be sharing a watch with a legend. Edmund looked down at his own shaking hands. He wasn't a legend. He was a prisoner, trapped in a body that was built for suffering, and trapped in a myth that wouldn't let him scream. He leaned his head against the cold concrete and waited for the dawn. Dawn on outpost. Bradley didn't break. It bled. A bruised purplish light filtered through the thinning fog, illuminating the sprawling complex in a sickly, jaundiced hue. The rain had stayed away, but the humidity had skyrocketed. The air felt thick enough to chew. It smelled of wet rust, overflowing latrines, and the exhaust of the heavy transport shuttles idling on the main tarmac. Edmund sat on an overturned ammunition crate just outside the eastern bunker complex. He had his boots unlaced, massaging the circulation back into his calves. His synthetic knee was locked in a dull, throbbing ache that radiated up to his hip. He was chewing on a compressed nutrient bar that tasted heavily of sawdust and artificial sweetener. It was 0600. His shift was over, but the adrenaline crash had left him too wired, too hollowed out to sleep. 50 yards away, a squad of Graxian heavy infantry was running morning drills. They moved with a synchronized mechanical precision. Their heavy boots slammed into the mud in perfect unison. Thud, thud, thud. They were practicing tactical retreats, falling back in a rigid grid formation, covering firing angles with cold, calculated efficiency. It made sense. It was logical. Edmund took another bite of his ration bar, the dry paste sticking to the roof of his mouth. He watched Corporal Miller among them, his green scales catching the dim morning light. Miller was flawless. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He was a perfect cog in a perfect war machine. "You're staring again, Edmund." Edmund didn't jump. He just slowly turned his head. Private Henderson was leaning against the concrete wall of the bunker, lighting a crumpled off-brand cigarette. Henderson was a kid, maybe 21, with a patchy beard and eyes that had seen too much orbital bombardment. He had a slight limp from a shrapnel wound he'd caught on a moon called Acheron 2 years ago. "Just watching the math work," Edmund muttered, turning back to the drilling squad. Henderson took a long drag, the cherry of the cigarette flaring bright orange. He exhaled a thin stream of gray smoke that immediately hung stagnant in the heavy air. "They move like they're on rails. It's creepy. You ever see one of them break formation?" "No," Edmund said. "They don't break. If they take fire, they halt, calculate the trajectory, return fire, and advance or retreat based on a statistical probability of survival." "Must be nice," Henderson scoffed, flicking a piece of tobacco off his lip. "Knowing exactly what to do, not waking up in a cold sweat because you thought the mess hall toaster was a proximity mine." Edmund didn't answer. He just looked at his hands. The tremor was back, just a faint vibration in his fingertips. The stabilizers from Dr. Hayes were wearing off faster than they should. His liver was probably working overtime to flush the chemicals out, treating the medicine like a poison. The human body was stupid that way. It always fought the very things trying to keep it together. Henderson tossed the half-smoked cigarette into a puddle. It died with a short hiss. "You hear the chatter on the local net? Command thinks the Tarn are moving a heavy artillery division through the southern swamps, trying to flank the outpost." The Tarn. The same alien faction that had turned Fort Bradley into a slaughterhouse. They were a hulking, four-armed species that communicated entirely through low-frequency sonar. You never heard them coming. You just felt the vibrations in your teeth right before the ground exploded. Edmund's stomach dropped. A cold, oily sensation pooled in his gut. The nutrient bar suddenly tasted like ash. "It's just chatter," Edmund lied, his voice tight. "The swamps are too deep for heavy armor. The mud would swallow their treads." "Yeah," Henderson said. though he didn't sound convinced. He kicked at a loose rock. "Probably just ghosts on the radar. Anyway, I'm headed to the racks. Try to get some rack time, Edmund. You look like a corpse." Henderson pushed off the wall and limped away toward the barracks. Edmund watched him go, feeling a sudden, intense spike of envy. Henderson could still sleep. He could still turn his brain off. Edmund reached down to lace up his boots. He needed to get back to his bunk. He needed to lie down in the dark and stare at the ceiling until the exhaust fans lulled him into a shallow, nightmare-ridden coma. He pulled the left lace tight. Then, the water in the puddle next to him vibrated. It wasn't a ripple from the wind. It was a sharp, concentric circle that started in the center and rushed to the edges. A fraction of a second later, Edmund felt a deep, resonant hum in his molars. It felt like a tuning fork had been struck inside his skull. The low-frequency sonar. The air raid sirens didn't even have time to activate. The first artillery shell hit the main landing tarmac. It didn't explode with a loud bang. Tarn munitions used a localized vacuum implosion. It sounded like a massive, wet cough. The shockwave wasn't fire. It was a sheer, concussive wall of displaced air that ripped outward at supersonic speeds. A transport shuttle, weighing over 80 tons, was lifted off the ground like a child's toy and slammed into the control tower. The metal shrieked. Concrete pulverized into a blinding gray cloud of dust. Edmund was thrown backward off the ammunition crate before his brain even registered the sound. He hit the reinforced steel door of the bunker, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs in a violent rush. The world went instantly, violently silent. His eardrums had ruptured. He slid down the door into the mud, gasping like a beached fish. He couldn't breathe. His lungs were paralyzed. The sky above him turned into a chaotic swirl of falling debris, twisted metal, and gray dust. Thump, thump, thump. He could feel the secondary shells hitting through the ground. The vibrations rattled his bones, shaking him so hard his teeth clicked together. Through the thick, choking dust, he saw the Graxian drill squad. They hadn't scattered. They hadn't panicked. True to their biology, they had instantly formed a defensive circle, raising their heavy energy shields. It was a textbook maneuver. It was perfectly logical. It was also completely useless against artillery. A third shell hit directly in the center of their formation. Edmund squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head away, curling into a tight, pathetic ball. He didn't want to see the math fail. He didn't want to see the red mist. His body was betraying him again. The chemical firestorm had ignited. Cortisol and adrenaline flooded his bloodstream. His heart rate spiked to 180 beats per minute. His vision narrowed to a tiny pinpoint tunnel. The panic wasn't just in his mind. It was a physical force, a rabid animal clawing at the inside of his ribs, demanding that he run. He dragged himself up, his fingers tearing at the muddy ground. His synthetic knee screamed in protest, but the pain was drowned out by the sheer, deafening roar of his own pulse. He had to get inside. He had to get underground. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the bunker door and pulled. It was locked. The automated lockdown protocol had engaged the moment the first shell hit. Edmund screamed. He couldn't hear himself, but he felt the raw vibration in his throat. He hammered his fists against the reinforced steel, bloodying his knuckles on the cold, unforgiving metal. He kicked it. He clawed at the seam. He was locked out in the rain of fire. He spun around, his back pressed against the door. The dust was so thick he could barely see 10 feet. The smell of pulverized concrete and burning ozone was suffocating. A shape materialized through the gray smoke. It was Higgins. The Graxian private was covered in a thick layer of dust, his uniform torn, green blood leaking from a deep shrapnel gash across his shoulder. He was dragging Davies by the strap of his tactical vest. Davies' left leg was gone below the knee, the wound cauterized by the heat of the blast, but the sheer kinetic shock had sent the alien into a catatonic state. Davies' eyes were rolled back, his jaw locked open in a silent scream. Higgins dropped Davies in the mud near Edmund and collapsed against the bunker wall, his chest heaving. He looked at Edmund, his alien face contorted in a mixture of pain and desperate hope. His mouth was moving. Edmund shook his head, tapping his bleeding ear. "I can't hear you." Higgins pointed frantically at the locked bunker door, then back out into the dust storm. The vibrations in the ground were getting stronger. The Tarn weren't just bombarding them, they were advancing. The heavy footfalls of their shock troopers were vibrating through the mud. Higgins grabbed Edmund's jacket, his three-fingered grip crushing the synthetic fabric. He pulled Edmund close. Even deafened, Edmund could read the Graxian's body language. It was a plea. "You're human," Higgins's eyes seemed to say. "You're the monster. Do something. Save us." Edmund stared into the terrified alien's eyes. He felt a hysterical, bubbling laugh rising in his chest. A laugh that tasted like vomit and copper. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a hidden reserve of strength. He just had a bladder that felt like it was going to let go, and a desperate, clawing need to be anywhere else in the universe. The ground heaved again, violently tossing all three of them into a tangle of limbs and mud. A section of the prefabricated bunker wall above them buckled outward with a deafening groan that Edmund felt deep in his chest. Rusted rebar and chunks of heavy permacrete crashed down, burying Davies' lower half and pinning Higgins's arm against the dirt. Edmund was thrown clear, rolling violently until he slammed against the rusted husk of a disabled transport rover. He lay there on his back, staring up at the choked, gray sky. His lungs burned. Every breath drew in a thick paste of silica and cordite that coated the back of his throat. His vision was swimming, the edges fringed with creeping black static. The adrenaline was hitting its peak, overloading his synapses. It wasn't the clean, focused energy of a Graxian entering combat mode. It was a toxic, messy overflow. His nervous system was screaming at him to flee, to fight, to freeze, all at the same time. He rolled onto his stomach and threw up. It was mostly bile and the bitter remnants of the nutrient bar. He coughed, spitting acid and dirt onto the rover's tire. He looked back toward the bunker door. Higgins was trapped. The large Graxian was pulling frantically at his pinned arm, his boots kicking uselessly in the mud. Davies was completely unresponsive, buried under a slab of concrete, his biological fail-safes having entirely shut his brain down to prevent death from shock. "Leave them," a dark lizard part of Edmund's brain hissed. "Crawl under the rover. Play dead. Survive." That was the truth of it. That was the human secret. You didn't become a hero. You just became a rat in a corner. Edmund's hands were shaking so violently he couldn't even grip the dirt. He was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow spasms. He felt warm liquid trailing down his thigh. He had wet himself. The sheer, unadulterated terror had simply overridden his bladder control. He felt pathetic. He felt like an animal. Through the thick, swirling dust, heavy shadows began to emerge. The Tarn. They were massive, 8 feet tall, heavily armored in dull gray plating that blended perfectly with the dust. Their forearm ended in heavy, pneumatic crushing claws or mounted pulse cannons. They didn't walk. They lumbered, their heavy footfalls causing the mud to vibrate. They were sweeping the area, executing the survivors with clinical, silent efficiency. One of them was moving toward the collapsed bunker, toward Higgins. Higgins saw it. The Graxian stopped pulling at his trapped arm. He slumped back against the rubble. He didn't scream. He didn't thrash. His species was built for logic. The math was absolute. He was trapped. The enemy was here. Survival probability was 0. Higgins closed his eyes and waited for the end. He accepted it. Edmund watched from beneath the bumper of the rover. He was pressing himself so hard into the mud, he felt like he was trying to phase through the planet's crust. His pulse was a jackhammer in his temples. Stay still, stay still, stay still. The Tarn soldier stopped in front of Higgins. It raised one of its heavy, pneumatic claws. It was going to crush the Graxian's skull like a ripe melon. Edmund closed his eyes. He didn't want to watch. He just wanted to go home. He wanted to sit in a quiet room with a glass of cold water. He wanted his mom. Then something snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't a heroic surge of bravery or a tactical calculation. It was the absolute, fundamental flaw in human biology. The human brain, when pushed completely past the threshold of terror, when cornered with no exit and flooded with a toxic cocktail of stress hormones, does not shut down. It does not accept the math. It short-circuits. It bypasses the frontal lobe entirely and hands the steering wheel over to millions of years of primitive, desperate evolution. Edmund didn't think. He reacted. He pushed off the mud with a guttural, wet scream that tore his vocal cords. He didn't have his rifle. He had dropped it during the first explosion. He had nothing. No weapons. No armor. Just a shaking, fragile body running purely on the fumes of absolute panic. He didn't run with military grace. He stumbled, his synthetic knee grinding and popping, his boots slipping in the mud. He looked like a drunken, rabid dog. The Tarn soldier didn't even turn its head until Edmund was already airborne. Edmund slammed into the alien's back. The impact felt like hitting a brick wall. His collarbone cracked audibly, a sharp, white-hot spike of agony that only fueled the chaotic firestorm in his brain. He scrambled up the Tarn's armored back like a rat climbing a drain pipe, wrapping his legs around the creature's thick neck. The Tarn stumbled forward, dropping its heavy claw, startled by the sudden, entirely illogical attack. Edmund didn't use martial arts. He didn't look for weak points in the armor. He was completely out of his mind. He was a creature of pure, terrified desperation. He jammed his thumbs under the edge of the Tarn's heavy helmet. He felt the soft, leathery flesh of the alien's neck. He squeezed. He gouged. He tore at the skin with his bare hands, his fingernails breaking and bleeding against the tough hide. The Tarn thrashed violently, its 4 arms reaching back to grab Edmund. A heavy, armored gauntlet smashed into Edmund's ribs. Crack. 2 ribs shattered. Edmund didn't let go. He couldn't. The pain wasn't registering as a deterrent. It was just adding more fuel to the fire. He was weeping. Tears and snot ran down his face, mixing with the dirt and the blood. He was screaming incoherently, high-pitched, ragged sounds of pure fear. He leaned his head down and bit the tarn. He sank his teeth into the exposed flesh of the alien's neck, right where the helmet met the armor plate. He tasted foul, oily, bitter blood. He clamped his jaw shut and viciously ripped his head back. The tarn let out a localized, low-frequency blast of agony that rattled Edmund's teeth so hard one of his molars cracked. The massive alien staggered backward, its hands clutching at its torn throat. Dark, viscous fluid sprayed wildly into the air. The tarn fell backward, landing heavily in the mud, crushing Edmund beneath its immense weight. The air was driven out of Edmund's lungs in a violent whoosh. The world went completely, blissfully black, the smell of bleach and burning ozone. Edmund slowly opened his eyes. The harsh, fluorescent light of the medical bay stabbed into his retinas like hot needles. He groaned, a dry, rattling sound that scraped against his ruined throat. Everything hurt. It wasn't a localized pain. It was a deep, systemic agony. His ribs burned with every shallow breath. His collarbone throbbed in time with his heartbeat. His mouth tasted like pennies and alien oil. He couldn't move his left arm. It was strapped tight to his chest in a rigid synthetic cast. "Don't try to sit up." The voice was tired, gravelly. Dr. Hayes stepped into his field of vision. The doctor looked worse than before. His scrubs were stained with a chaotic mosaic of human red, Graxian green, and tarn black. He held a small data pad in his shaking hand. "You have 3 broken ribs," Hayes recited flatly, not looking up from the pad. "A fractured clavicle, a hairline fracture in your left femur, severe bruising to your internal organs, and you bit entirely through your own lip. You're lucky to be breathing." Edmund blinked slowly, trying to clear the sluggish chemical fog from his brain. They had him on heavy painkillers, the good stuff, the kind that made the room feel like it was made of cotton. "The outpost?" Edmund croaked. "Held," Hayes said, finally looking down at him. "The Tarn vanguard got too far ahead of their artillery support. General Sullivan rallied the heavy infantry and pushed them back into the swamps. It was close, too close." Edmund closed his eyes. He remembered the dust. He remembered the sheer, suffocating terror. He remembered the feeling of warm urine down his leg as he hid under the rover. "I panicked, Doc," Edmund whispered, the shame burning hotter than his broken ribs. "I lost my mind. I was so scared." Hayes set the datapad down on a metal tray. He pulled up a stool and sat heavily next to the bed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at Edmund with a profound, weary sadness. "I know," Hayes said softly. "I saw the medical telemetry from your suit. Your heart rate hit 210. Your cortisol levels were toxic. You went into acute psychological shock." Edmund turned his head away, staring at the blank, white wall. He was a coward. He was a pathetic, broken thing that just happened to survive. The blast doors to the med bay hissed open. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed on the tile. Clang, whir, clang, whir. General Sullivan walked in. The massive Graxian looked like he had been put through a meat grinder. His tungsten prosthetic arm was dented and scored with plasma burns. His armor was cracked, oozing a slow trickle of green fluid from a breach in his side. But his single, red optical sensor was burning bright. Trailing behind Sullivan was Private Higgins. Higgins had his arm in a sling, his green scales pale and ashen. But as he looked at Edmund, his eyes were wide. They weren't filled with the nervous, mocking humor from the mess hall. They were filled with an absolute, reverent awe. Sullivan stopped at the foot of Edmund's bed. He stood at attention, ignoring his own wounds. Higgins immediately snapped a clumsy salute with his good arm. "We pulled you out from under the tarn," Sullivan rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "You had your hands locked around its throat so tightly we had to pry your fingers back with a pry bar." Edmund swallowed hard. He didn't look at Sullivan. He looked at Hayes, pleading with his eyes for the doctor to tell them the truth, to tell them it was just a panic attack, a biological glitch. Hayes just looked down at the floor. "Private Higgins filed his report," Sullivan continued, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "He testified that you were unarmed, that you threw yourself at a fully armored Tarn shock trooper to protect a wounded ally, that you fought it with your bare hands, tearing its throat out with your teeth." "Sir, Edmund started, his voice cracking. He wanted to tell them. He wanted to scream that he wasn't a hero, that he had wet his pants, that he was just a terrified rat backed into a corner, thrashing wildly in the dark. Sullivan raised his heavy organic hand, cutting Edmund off. "You proved my point, Edmund," Sullivan said softly, the reverence in his voice making Edmund's stomach churn. "They laughed at the myths. They thought humanity was fragile. They thought logic dictated survival." Sullivan looked back at Higgins. The young private nodded slowly, staring at Edmund like he was a god. "But you showed them," Sullivan said, turning his glowing red eye back to Edmund. "You showed them the unbreakable spirit of your kind. You showed them that when a human is broken, unarmed, and facing certain death, they do not surrender. They embrace the fury." Sullivan reached out and laid his heavy, scarred hand gently over Edmund's blanketed foot. "It is an honor to serve with a legend," Sullivan whispered. The general turned and walked out of the med bay, the heavy clang whir of his steps fading into the corridor. Higgins lingered for a second, giving Edmund one last awestruck look before scurrying out after his commander. The blast doors hissed shut. Silence descended on the room, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Edmund stared at the ceiling. A single tear leaked from the corner of his eye, cutting a hot track through the grime still caked on his cheek. "Did you hear him, Doc?" Edmund whispered, his voice trembling. "He thinks I embraced the fury. He thinks I'm a hero." Dr. Hayes stood up slowly. He walked over to the IV drip hanging next to Edmund's bed and adjusted the flow rate, increasing the dosage of the painkillers. "I heard him," Hayes said quietly. "Why didn't you tell them?" Edmund pleaded, turning to look at the doctor, the tears coming faster now. "Why didn't you show them the telemetry? Why didn't you tell them I was just a terrified animal?" Hayes looked down at Edmund, his own eyes wet and rimmed with red. He reached out and gently patted Edmund's uninjured shoulder. "Because they need the myth, Edmund," Hayes said, his voice thick with sorrow. "The Graxians, the Tarn, the whole damn galaxy. They need to believe we are indomitable warriors. They need to believe we fight on spite and fury. If they knew the truth." Hayes paused, looking away, staring at his own blood-stained hands. "If they knew that we fight like that just because we are absolutely, paralyzingly terrified of dying," Hayes whispered, "they wouldn't fear us anymore. They would just pity us." Hayes turned and walked away, disappearing into the back office of the med bay, leaving Edmund alone in the sterile light. Edmund closed his eyes as the heavy painkillers finally began to drag him under. The pain faded, the room dissolved into shadows. But as he drifted off into the dark, the last thing he felt was the phantom tremor returning to his hand, a silent, vibrating testament to the ugly, terrified truth of humanity. Edmund's tremor is a reminder of the ugly truth we carry in the dark. If this gritty dive into the reality of human survival hit you where it hurts, don't leave Edmund alone in the med bay. Hit that like button to show your support for raw, unfiltered sci-fi. Share this story with fellow HFY fans who know that true grit isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and surviving anyway. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a transmission from the Outer Rim. Drop a comment below. How long would you survive the trenches of Fort Bradley?